at 4 o'clock is what I show. And with that, we just had our confirmation of a quorum with the second item on our agenda. And then I guess if there's nothing for the city manager or Greg Clifton or Miss Anderson to add, I guess we'll start with our next agenda item, which is the public infrastructure stormwater by water services.
Thank you, Charlie. Unless, Greg, you want to say anything, I'm just going to jump right in.
Can I introduce you to the group?
Sure, that sounds good.
I'll do that. And thank you, Chair Odegaard. Looks like Ed Schenk is going to start this off. I'm sure Ed will have others accompany him. Ed is on our water services team, and he heads up our stormwater group and has been greatly involved in a lot of infrastructure issues of late. Ed, it's good to have you here, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Greg. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully I don't break it. Okay. So what we're talking about today is public infrastructure, in particular stormwater. And we're going to go over the stormwater needs and why we're here as part of the bond election selection, if you will. Okay, so to give you a quick overview, the stormwater section is within water services, has a long history at the city of Flagstaff. Most of that history was under community development, since we do quite a bit of development review. And a lot of our stormwater infrastructure and response, drainage, etc., is actually addressed at the development level. So as we build out the city of Flagstaff, we try at the city to make sure that drainage is addressed correctly as that build out is occurring. So we were originally under community development, spent a little bit of time at Public Works, and then we're over in water services, and that's where we are today and have been for over a decade. We are a utility. Stormwater actually collects a utility rate through that water bill that you get every month. Not unique in the United States, but definitely different than most cities. So there's, I believe, 7 or 8 stormwater utilities within Arizona out of all of the communities. Most stormwater programs are usually underneath engineering, the water department, community development, public works, etc., as part of their larger program. Here in Flagstaff, the stormwater actual infrastructure itself can be broken down into 2 general categories. We have kind of the underground system, you know, your pipes, your catch basins, your scuppers, your vaults, detention basins, underground detention basins, etc. Kind of hard to see here, but that map on the left actually has that all mapped out, everything that's underground. It's quite a system. And then on the right is everything that's open channels, everything that is a stream, a channel, a wash, an open detention basin, etc. And we have about 28 miles of major streams and washes. When we say major, those are streams and washes that are on the radar of the state and federal agencies that we work with. So that would be FEMA, and then at the state level, ADEQ, Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, as well as more recently, a lot of work with DEMA, which is the Department of Emergency and Military Affairs. Besides that, we have roughly about 120 miles of smaller channels. These would be your little ditches, swales, etc., that feed into these larger channels. Our stormwater maintenance is completed here within water services. We work quite a bit with Public Works as well, with their group as appropriate, to do regular maintenance. And this can be, again, separated into closed, which would be underground channel maintenance, and then also our open channel maintenance above ground. We are still building out this program in both the closed and open components. For a long time, this was completed by Public Works. And then as they've had staffing issues and capacity issues, it's transferred over to water services. So we're not recreating the wheel, but we are kind of filling out our ranks, if you will, both staff-wise as well as equipment-wise as moving forward.
Mr. Schenk, can I just pause you for 1 sec? Sure. One of our committee members, Mr. Ghetto, says he cannot see our presentation. And I see
Okay,
Mike Anderson responded to him saying shows that he is in the meeting. And the suggestion was to leave the meeting and maybe to rejoin. Um, and I'm going to maybe just pause for a sec. Thank you for your patience in your presentation. And we'll see if Mr. Ghetto does that real quick.
no problem. Thank you for that, Charlie. I do have problems seeing comments when I'm in this shared screen, so I'm going to see if I can get my phone to also log in so I can see comments as they come up.
Okay, and maybe there is a question from our Vice Chair, Ms. White.
So Charlie, just to bring you up to speed with what we did last week, we're writing our comments down, but we're taking them. I'm sorry, we're writing our questions down, but we're taking the questions at the end of the
At the presentations.
Yeah, so that we could get through them.
Perfect. And so with that, I think I'll just have you start with the presentation, and thank you for your patience and with me.
Thank you, Charlie. I do see the one question that's in the comments already. Great question. If it's easiest, I'll just answer questions at the end, and we can go back to given slides if that helps, so we can kind of walk through some of those questions. And if I'm going too fast or if something needs some clarification, I'm happy to stop at any point and give a little clarification or go back in time. Okay, so we were talking about stormwater maintenance. We were talking about a little bit of the history of the stormwater section here at the City of Flagstaff. And I am glossing over some things here. I'm trying to keep this central to our ask in the bond. There is quite a bit that the stormwater section does that I won't be going over today. Some of the details of development review, some of the details of our FEMA regulations that we administer at the stormwater section. Some of the outstanding studies and designs that it's interesting stuff, but I don't think it's very pertinent to what we're talking about today. But I'm always happy to go into any of the other details if requested, at the end. But I'm really kind of trying to focus on our ask here. So this is somewhat focused, or at least I'm attempting to focus this presentation as we go through. So we're talking about maintenance here. And obviously that leads to the next step of the funding. So the stormwater utility is funded by a rate, and this rate is based off of an equivalent residential unit, an ERU. And this isn't something that the City of Flagstaff created on its own. ERUs are actually pretty well established as a rate unit throughout the United States for those stormwater utilities that exist out there. So for Flagstaff specifically, our ERU is based on impervious surfaces. So we actually every few years refly the city aerial imagery, create a new impervious surface for GIS, and then we calculate the amount of impervious surface per parcel to determine the rate. And those rates are that ERU is based on units of 1,500 square feet. So essentially what the assumption is that 1,500 square feet of impervious surface should be this residential unit, this unit of measurement. For residents, we cap it at 5. So it does not go above 5. If you have a truly large house or a really large parking lot, your rate will be capped at 5. For commercial properties, it can obviously go up quite a bit higher. The last rate adjustment was in 2018. This was driven mostly by the Rio Flag Flood Control Project, as that was approved by City Council and also by the Army Corps of Engineers. And that rate was mostly to capture the $54 million that we have or will have in bond debt to create the Rio Flag Flood Control Project. There is some funding, obviously, within that rate fee for general operations, and that's roughly $1 million annually, and that's for capital improvement projects to our existing infrastructure, as well as maintenance and general operations. I will say that core staffing and our maintenance. Minimal might not be the right term here. It's in the slide, but it's set at a low level. Let's put it that way. And rates have not been adjusted since 2018. Well, what has happened since 2018? Obviously, we've had that museum fire just outside the city limits, and that's had quite an impact on city operations, including stormwater. That is not included in this fee, nor are some of the impacts that we're starting to see from climate change and climate variability. So some of these truly large rain events, these very intense rain events that we seem to be seeing much more frequently in between our drop periods, are having some impacts on our stormwater maintenance and our stormwater system, and that is not fully reflected in our current rate. So a quick update on our flood events from this last year. We had that fire, as I mentioned, up in Dry Lake Hills in 2019. Most of that fire was in the Spruce Wash watershed, which drains through Grandview, Sunnyside, across the tracks and then down near 4th and Butler before it connects up with the Rio to Flag. We had 2 years of essentially no monsoon seasons, fairly extreme drought until this year. And then this year we had 4 large rain events on that fire burn scar, as well as some pretty severe rain events outside of the burn scar. The estimated cost to the city in terms of response was $1.8 million this year. And I should say that while this was a rather active monsoon season, it was not record. It was about 14th strongest on record at the airport, which is above average, but not extreme or noteworthy outside of the regs norm, I should say. So as I mentioned, we had 4 large flood events within the museum fire scar, a relatively rare 200-year event on Mount Eldon that actually did some damage on the headwaters up on the mountain drainages, which should, well, shouldn't say should, the models are showing that it is increasing our flood risk for East Flagstaff. And then 2 other flood events, one in University Heights and one in a sub-watershed of the Rio to Flag just upstream of the Cheshire neighborhood that had some fairly severe impacts on some county properties. So they're going to go over the scope of the projects in this bond request. And obviously our biggest need that's relatively unfunded right now is in that Spruce watershed. So the watershed that drains or is impacted by the museum fire scar. All of these first bullet points are tied together, so they're separate projects, but to actually have a meaningful impact on the Sunnyside neighborhood, they really do need to all be completed at some point. Otherwise, they don't really work well on their own. So essentially, it is a network of projects to provide a flood mitigation. The last one is related, South Mount Eldon Detention and Diversion. It will reduce the amount of sediment and water to the Spruce watershed, but it's not directly in line. And the total request is a little over $22 million as it stands today. So the first project, the Spruce Channel Master Plan. This is a master plan and feasibility study for the entirety of Spruce Wash within city limits that is impacted by the flood. We actually are doing this plan right now. So the question could come up, why are we asking for it in the bond? It is being paid for out of our stormwater reserves at the moment. So essentially we are borrowing from ourselves to get this paid out of. So at some point it does need to get fully funded. And this is a study that's required, or a master plan is required for any future work that's done within the Spruce Channel. So to make sure that we have no adverse impact, that any projects that we do not push the flood from one part of the neighborhood into another part of the neighborhood. So this is something that both the county and the city require for any of their large drainage projects, is to have a no adverse impact plan or study, and this master plan would do that for us. So at the moment, we are conducting this master plan, but it is rather unfunded. So moving from upstream to downstream, the first crossing that we have within the city is at Linda Vista. And if any of you have been out there during the flooding from this summer, this is really where we see the start of the big impacts. So we improved this culvert last year, well, 2 years ago now, 2020. Originally had one single pipe that went underneath Linda Vista. It could only convey about 180 cubic feet per second, which is a volume of water per second. We put in another culvert in 2020 to upsize it so that it would match the downstream capacity. So unfortunately, the downstream capacity is also limited, as I'll go over in a little bit. So we only can increase it to roughly 320 to 340 cubic feet per second. So still fairly small, considering that most of our floods that we saw this last summer were over 1,000 cubic feet per second. So we have a bottleneck here. It's a big deal because unfortunately what happens is when the water goes over the road, due to the topography, it doesn't just go over the road and then back into the channel on the other side. Linda Vista actually slopes down to the south. So a lot of that water, as soon as it gets on the road, instead of going into the channel, it goes down the street and into Grandview and impacts that Grandview neighborhood. So it's actually kind of diverts itself away from the channel, and it takes quite a bit of time before it reconnects to the channel on the south side of Sunnyside. So what we need to do is increase the capacity of this culvert to allow for those 1,000 CFS events that we've been seeing this year, and to push the water from there to our next bottlenecks and to improve those bottlenecks as we go. Estimated cost is about 1.2 million. A lot of that cost really is in utility relocations. We have natural gas in the area, we have sewer, we have water. There's franchise utilities. Those would be the utilities that are not owned by the city, such as APS, that we need to work with to move so that we can actually upsize this channel. In this slide, it says we're conducting studies of current design and alternatives. I can say pretty confidently that this will probably end up being a concrete box culvert. So right now it's 2 metal pipes. Probably in the future will be either 1 or 2 concrete square culverts. So the next bottleneck, if we're moving down the watershed, is the next road crossing actually. So Cedar Avenue culvert. This is right here at Cedar Avenue. Roughly has a capacity of about 340 CFS. That's why we couldn't make Linda Vista larger in 2020. So much like Linda Vista, we're going to need to increase the capacity of this culvert as well to allow those large flows to continue to go in the channel. Relatively the same estimated cost. We're talking roughly in the 1.2 million range with the same issues. With utility relocations and then also traffic control, because Cedar is an arterial, will be a challenge for us. Next downstream is the Dorsa Inlet improvement. We actually have a design for this already. This is where the channel goes from a surface channel into an underground pipe. So at the moment we have a 60-inch pipe that was installed about 60 years ago. That has a capacity of a little over 400 CFS. Pre-fire, 400 CFS was way more than we expected to ever see. It was greater than their 100-year storm event. Right now, it's not cutting it. It's getting overwhelmed pretty easily. So we do have a design for a 12-foot by 8-foot single barrel box culvert that would cross under Dorsa Avenue, and then out into a channel improvement downstream. As I mentioned, this is fully designed. We actually have this planned out to be built, and we have funding for it allocated right now. The reason why we're asking for it out of the bond is we are borrowing from other capital improvement projects, essentially kicking the can down the road on other projects that have been planned out for 10 years or longer. So hoping to pay those back. Downstream of Dorsa Inlet, we're going to need to divert water out of that channel, out of the new pipe, through Ponderosa Park and into the new Killip Detention Basin. So this is under design right now, also by SWI Engineering, Shepherd Westminster. to determine how we'll do that. Estimated cost at the moment is about 1.4 million. It's still kind of up in the air since we do not have a solid design yet. On the left, you can see some of the clean out of the channel at Arroyo Seco from the summer. On the right, you can see just a general schematic of moving the water from that kind of upper left portion of the photo to the lower right, and that whole open field that you see on the lower left is where those detention basins are going in right now. Killup School of Detention Basins. This is actually funded. We probably take this out, but like most of the other projects we're working on, we borrowed from other projects to make this work. So this is a series of 2 detention basins at Killup School to slow the water, to store and slow the water that we see coming off of Spruce Wash in central Sunnyside, and then to release that water back into the channel after the flooding has subsided, or after the channel has the capacity to take it. So if you look at that, it's kind of hard to see with this PowerPoint, but if you look at the sketch on the lower left, you can see the footprint of the new school, and then you can see a soccer field and a softball field. The soccer field and the softball field, you can see the lines around them. Those are contour intervals. So essentially, we're going to be sinking a soccer field and a softball field into 2 detention basins. So 11 months out of the year, we can use it for soccer and softball, and 1 month out of the year, we're going to be cleaning out floodwater out of those. Hopefully, they'll be clean floodwater, and it'll flow through pretty easily. The pipes you see on the right, this is actually taken last week, maybe 2 weeks ago. So this is at the detention basin staging grounds right now. Those large pipes that you see next to the truck, those are new 60-inch outlet structures. So essentially, we're going to be draining this detention basin using a new 60-inch line that will go from west to east and connect up to the existing underground infrastructure. So construction has begun on this. Flagstaff Unified School District is our partner, and they are using Core Engineering and Core Construction to work on this right now. So this is ongoing, very exciting stuff. Now, throughout the system, so downstream of the detention basin and also in between each of these road crossings, we're going to have to do channel improvements to convey that greater than 1,000 CFS flood. So those channel improvements in some areas may be underground. They may be a box culvert like you see the schematic, a generic one on the right, or it might be an open channel, possibly concrete lined, maybe riprap lined, trapezoidal channel. You can see kind of a schematic of that on the left. But essentially, all of the channel from Linda Vista all the way down to Route 66 will need some type of improvement to convey that flow. And that's where that master plan really comes into play, and future engineering design comes into play. So all those segments, the estimated cost, we're still working through it with our feasibility study, but I'd say it's upwards of $12 million. Just looking at the scale of some of the other large drainage projects around the country, as well as the Rieta flood control project, it costs quite a bit of money to put in these large box culverts. Changing the area a little bit. So we were working from upstream to downstream within Spruce Wash. Now we're going to work a little bit more to the side laterally. We have a design or a concept design for a detention basin and a diversion structure in East Flagstaff. And this is related to Spruce Wash because both of those detention and diversion structures drain off of or mitigate floods that come off of the south side of Mount Eldon. And some of that water from south side of Mount Eldon actually makes it to Spruce Wash, just upstream of Linda Vista. And when that happened twice this year, it brought down quite a bit of sediment. Some of it fine, sands, clays, but some of it not fine. There's actually some fairly large boulders and large rock that came down. So to mitigate some of this tributary flooding that's not related to the fire directly, but it does relate to the flooding we see in Sunnyside, and it does relate to flooding we see upstream So in Shadow Mountain neighborhood, Greenlaw, we have these concept designs for this detention basin on the natural gas pipeline, and then also a diversion structure to move water from one tributary into another tributary that will drain into one of the county designed sediment basins that is going to be constructed upstream of Linda Vista. So both of these currently are unfunded. We are just at the concept design level. Still quite a bit of work that will need to be done within design as well as construction. And we also need to work with Kinder Morgan, the pipeline company, for access and potential acquisition, which is something we will be working on later this month. Estimated costs at the moment, assuming that we don't have to excavate a lot of rock or bedrock, is roughly $2 million for both of those projects, the detention and diversion structure. Okay, so going through a lot of projects here, a lot of cost. So what are the impacts if we don't address this? What happens if we just continue as we did this summer and just reactively clean up after the fact? It's pretty likely, unless we have many more years of extreme drought, that we will continue to have flood damage. We can say this looking at the current watershed. The county flood control district has done a sediment study within the museum fire area, which shows that we still have a very extreme risk. Arizona Geological Survey has a concurrent study going on right now that shows that we have still extreme flood risk within the museum fire. And then also looking next door at the Schultz fire watershed from the 2010 fire there, they still are having elevated flows and sediment coming through there. So we should expect to see continued infrastructure damage, property damage, erosion and degradation of the natural areas, the forested areas, and then increased financial strain. It did cost us, as I mentioned in one of the first slides, $1.8 million in public infrastructure response, and that's just the price tag. That's not the tag for staff time and diverted equipment. So essentially, we had most of Public Works, Stormwater, Water Services, the police department, and many other groups out during monsoon season, really responding to this museum fire, which meant that they weren't doing their regular jobs. So there's other areas of the community that were being underserved, if you will, from July through September due to response to the museum fire. And then also something that hasn't really been quantified, but I think it's probably higher than the 1.8 we just mentioned, is quality of life. So the people who live in Sunnyside, who live in Grandview, who live in these areas that are heavily impacted by flooding, their quality of life is obviously degraded, if you want to call it that way, due to these events. I mean, if you go through there, if you live in those areas, the amount of dust, the amount of disturbance, the flooding, it had put some very extreme strains on the people who lived in that area. Water quality, public health could also be negatively impacted, loss of community trust in the city, and then non-compliance with our regulations that we have to follow here at the city level are all also things we need to consider with this. And then here are just the listed council goals and objectives related to this bond request by Stormwater. No real surprises here. And with that, I think I am going to be open for questions.
Well, thank you. With what Vice Chair White had mentioned earlier concerning the how questions will be answered at the end of the presentation, and I'm not sure if you follow the chat box, and I thought maybe it best, take questions in order, so then you can scroll down through the chat box and answer them. And maybe if you wouldn't mind, Mr. Schenk, as read what the question was and then the response, and then you might have to have some help from city management to answer any questions. So does that sound fair? A good way of doing it? Oh, you're on mute, Mr. Shank.
Sorry
There
about
you
that.
go.
That,
No
that
worries.
sounds
No
great.
worries.
So I'm looking at my phone because I can actually see the questions here, and I had to refresh the chat. So let me just scroll back here. Okay, maybe I'm seeing these in different order. I saw one of the first questions was, oh yeah, why are there breaks in the system? Oh, I wish my phone would work a little better here. So I scrolled back to that slide here. So on the right-hand side, we have the open channels, those pink or magenta, or the city maintained reaches, and then you have the rest of the watershed, either in blue, or if it's the Rio flag, it's sort of that bluish green. We can only maintain what we own, the city owns, or what we have a publicly dedicated drainage easement for. So that's what we show in pink is either city owned or a section that has a drainage easement. Anything that's privately owned that does not have a public drainage easement, we have to rely on that private landowner. Now, if that private landowner is doing something that's outside of our regulations or code, and we do have both FEMA regulations as well as city code for drainage ways, then we can enforce that at the city level to make sure that they are keeping that drainage way open. But in terms of actual city maintenance, we will not be maintaining that channel. So we really can only address drainage concerns in those private areas through code and regulation.
So who checks that? Who checks to make sure that those are open and free? I mean, it strikes me as at the last minute, it would be devastating if all of a sudden there was a log jam there and water was diverted elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a great question. If it's truly private property and we have no easements on it, then we really rely on either citizens calling in, or if there actually is a flood, then we have to go to where it becomes a civil matter, so a legal matter. But in terms of we really can't go on private property and check it if we have no easement or no access agreement to get onto that property. So in that case, it's not something we can actually at the city level address unless it's brought up as a complaint.
All right, thanks.
And I have a question about this, like, too. I'm wondering how much the community is engaged in being volunteers to help with this kind of work. I know there's plenty of trash pickups, and I'm wondering how often you all engage with the community to get this work done. I'm assuming that you have limited capacity, as all departments do.
That's a great question. Yeah, so in the past we had dedicated volunteer days. So between Stormwater, Community Stewards, which is housed by Sustainability, and then other nonprofits like Friends of the Rio or like the NEU, Green Jacks, we had a number of stream volunteer days to clean the channel, and that's worked pretty good, but it's limited. So something that we're working towards right now is something called Stream Stewards. It's very similar to the Adopt a Foots or Adopt a Street program. And this is being kind of championed by Sustainability, the Stormwater Section, and Friends of the Rio, a nonprofit. It's still in the works. We still have to get through some legal hoops and then also some waivers. But we are working towards getting that program up and running. It'll mostly be on that magenta you're seeing here, or pink. It'll be on something that's city owned or managed, mostly city owned. We really can't allow private folks to go on someone else's private property if there's just an easement there. But we do have some initial interest by groups that have ownership of some of these sections, so that they can actually maintain their own private property and let us know how they're doing it. And we're working with them as well. So stay tuned. It'll probably be rolled out a little later this year, depending on when we can jump through all the hoops.
Hey Ed, this is Andy Bertelson, Water Services Director. I can help you out with the questions as well, if that would help you. The next is, are the bullet points listed in order of priority? And City Manager Clifton had noted that we would prioritize the projects. Further down, I note that Vice Chair White speak to us about the possibilities of matching FEMA or state funds that may be available for specific projects. Would these funds change the priority of a project? Great question, Vice Chair White. And we had talked about this in the budget retreat today with the City Council, and that any funds that are out there at the federal or state level, we work to leverage those funds with any local funds that we may have. And if the funding source is ripe, so to speak, and it fits a certain project, then that project could possibly jump in priority if the funding source is there and available and there's a timeline associated with the funding source. So sorry, Ed, to steal your thunder, but
no, thank you, Andy. And yeah, if you don't mind taking the question, it's really, my phone keeps on turning off,
yeah.
so or the screen turns off after we redo it. And one thing to add to Andy's comment there, yes, we definitely go after federal and state money. Part of the discussion we had earlier today on budget retreat was the federalization of some projects, and it wasn't specific to this. It was actually, I believe, more to road infrastructure, but something that also it can impact these projects. So what does federalization mean? I don't think a lot of people realize, including myself when I started the city, that there's no such thing as free money. So when we get a federal grant, it usually comes with quite a bit of strings attached. So for example, Stormwater got a grant for drainage improvements at the very bottom of Spruce Wash. It took 2 years to get that funding. We still don't have that grant signed off on. And the holdup is the federal, since it is federal money, they have to go through their own federal regulations and federal permitting, which is above and beyond what we normally have to go through. So they have to do an entire cultural survey of the area. They have to do a NEPA survey, so National Environmental Protection Act survey for environmental and cultural resources, endangered species surveys. Then they have to also go through the Army Corps 404 and 408 and 401 permitting as well. So without going into too many details, I think I probably already did. The problem with some of these things is it can really, really slow down a project. So sometimes that money comes in and you're like, all right, great, we got some money out of the federal government. And we sometimes have to turn that money back because it may be 4 or 5 years before we actually see that money and see the ability to do a project. So for something like this, where we're trying to work relatively quickly, we definitely approach the state and federal monies as best we can, because obviously we have a big ask here, we have a big need, but we do it cautiously because there's always potential that we might spin our wheels a little bit.
Ed, and I see City Manager Clifton has his hand raised. Sorry, Vice Chair White.
That's right. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'd like to offer a couple of comments that I think might also address either existing questions or ones that I anticipate. On the priority, I will add that the feasibility study and the modeling that is currently underway, and by the way, that's going to be concluded in the next few weeks, that will give us guidance as to the priority of these projects. That is one of the purposes of that feasibility study. So that information is forthcoming. Why are there projects happening this year? We had opportunities to do some things this year, and we needed to get moving on these. The Killup School, which by the way flooded last summer, is being rebuilt, and that is under a tight timeline. And the detention basin that Ed talked at length about, thank you, Ed, is tied to that school. So there's a window of opportunity that was going to close if we did not hop on board. So we found the money to make it happen, and we working in tandem with FUSD, it is happening. We would not have that opportunity a year from now. So we had to do that. That in turn is necessitating improvements, as Ed pointed out, in the Dorsa Inlet structure in the channel. So those are also in the works, and I'm tying a few things together here. The Dorsa project has been a little bit slowed down because we are having to acquire property rights. The city does not currently have all the easement rights in there for stormwater infrastructure. We are going at light speed to get those property rights secured. We brought in outside counsel, outside appraisers to help us in that. It's an all hands on deck sort of arrangement so we can do some improvements this year that are really important from a timing standpoint. Beyond that, we will look to guidance from the feasibility study as to what projects are prioritized. The significance of what you have in front of you is that this is a list of projects. Some of these will be concluded, most of them will not, but they're all important, and we're pretty sure that the feasibility study will outline that they're all important and give us more guidance as to what happens when. I think it is not an overreach for me to say all of these are high priority projects. If we can do them all in 1 year, we probably would, but we can't. So they will need to be strategically pursued in some order. That said, I think it's probably a given with everything that Ed has talked about, that all of these projects are of a high priority. We cannot do pieces of this drainage and continue to have bottlenecks elsewhere. It only makes sense that we complete all of them as soon as possible. And finally, and I'll let it go with this, I saw a question in there that I'll go ahead and address. You know, it's a very good question about, do the rates cover these things? The quick answer is no, not really. You can see the figure there, 22 million, give or take. And you will also note, as Ed pointed out in his narrative, the last time the fee was assessed or evaluated was 2018. Well, that predated the fire and it predated the floods. It's a whole new landscape that we're dealing with as we think about things like climate change, the droughts, and then you add to that the burn and the risk of flood that has been greatly elevated, and the fact that there's still a lot of sediment up in the burned area. We're not dealing with the same set of circumstances that we were in 2018. Everything has changed. The Rio project, the Rio de Flag project, has been underway for decades, and that is being pursued. And to Ed's comment just now, that is very much a federalized project because it's being pursued by the Army Corps of Engineers. It's a different project that interrelates with all of these things. The good news from last summer is that the Rio, while we hit capacity in it, we did not have the same flood events that we saw in these neighborhoods. We could have very easily. We were that close. At any rate, I wanted to address those questions and maybe add a little bit more narrative that might be explanatory, and I'll turn it back to you, Ed. Thank you.
So may I interrupt for a second? Charlie, you okay?
Go ahead, Vice Chair, and then we'll get to the next question from
Well, I just wanted to
franchise utilities responsible for costs.
Yeah, I wanted to bring this up because from the our committee's standpoint, we're going to be asked to recommend a list that if everything that was a top priority was on that list would exceed our capacity to bond for, and we already are in a position where we are exceeding the council recommendation of $70 million. And so we have to know, I think, or it behooves us to know what really has to be done first, and what can be put off to a shortly, but a later date. When I'm looking at the introduction to this particular stormwater section, I see that all of these, Spruce, Linda Vista, Cedar, Dorsa, you kind of have to do them all, or you'll create a bottleneck somewhere else. So I realize that the Rio de Flag is certainly a great example of a federalized project, and seeing how long that takes to get done and how long it took to get the federal pieces of it. Asking about matching funds, you'd have to essentially go after those now for projects you don't even know are going to be approved by us or the council, or bonded for certainly by the voters. So I understand that. I guess it would have moved that anything that you knew you could get federal matching funds for, or state matching funds, and we haven't even talked about the state yet, and would be obvious for us to move to the top of the priority list if we had to cut other things out. So I just want you to know what I'm trying to put together in my mind, at least, and hopefully for the rest of the committee, a rough idea of what has to come first. Thanks. Sorry that took so long.
Thank you, Vice Chair White. And I see Shannon Anderson has her hand raised.
Thanks, Andy. Vice Chair White, I just wanted to respond to the discussion just had, to let you know that city staff and New Point have been working together to talk about how we create flexibility within the bond language. We realize that we're going after whatever funding is available, both at the state and or the federal level. And we may not know if we're going to receive that funding on the same timing that we're working on making bond recommendations to City Council. And so you should look forward to having that information at a future meeting so that we're able to talk through how do we create that flexibility, knowing that even though something might be a top priority, if we're able to get funding from that somewhere else, then it allows us to go further down the line. So we'll be working on that, and hopefully we'll have something to bring to you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon and Vice Chair White and Chair Odegaard. I know you wanted to get to one of our committee members had a question. Dara Marks Marino, are the franchise utilities responsible for those costs? I'll go ahead and answer that. The answer is yes. However, if it's not their priority, that franchise utility might not be. It might not be something that they're super excited about getting to quickly, and it might not meet our timeline. And so while it is their responsibility, there are times when they will ask us as the project managers to contribute to the cost of a relocation or what have you. And then further with federal funds, Devana, you had asked about federal funding and infrastructure. And Ed, if you wanted to put that list back up, those funds are out there. The environmental infrastructure funds were just released. They can be super competitive. We were fortunate to get, I believe, 1.5 for the Killip Detention Basin, and I believe that was referenced by one of the comments in the chat from Michelle James. So, for example, if there's 1.5 for that Killip Detention Basin, the Arroyo Seco diversion through Ponderosa Park, there's an inlet to that detention basin associated with that project. And so can we then utilize those funds for Killip, for example, to build that inlet to that Killip detention basin? So that's really a long way of saying we're constantly looking to leverage those funds. And then to Ed's point, in the flood control district, even referenced since the other night, heaven forbid we have to turn away money because it doesn't meet our timeline. And there's a certain level of, this is an emergency response effort, and the urgency, the federal funding structures don't always work on that level of urgency. So, Ed, I hope that answered those questions, and I see Dara has her hand raised.
Yeah, and before we get to Dara, maybe Mr. Miller would like to weigh in and then might answer Dara's question, and then we'll go back to Dara after Mr. Miller. Thank you. Thank you for your patience, everybody.
I just wanted to add some clarification to Andy's response as it related to the franchise utilities. I'm worried I missed the context of the question, but I think it was in relation to relocation of franchise utilities associated with these stormwater projects. Is that correct? Okay. So the franchise utilities actually pay for relocations of their infrastructure, provided that the city has pre-existing rights or prior rights to that property. And so that was an important point that I think Andy missed, was not to correct you too much, Andy, but we had one project, and this is the Spruce Avenue wash between Cedar and Dorsa. The gas company actually has prior rights within that area because we don't have an easement in that area. So that puts the liability or financial responsibility on the city to relocate that utility. So it all comes down to prior rights, and it differs in every single situation. Anytime we have prior rights, we take advantage of that and require that utility to pay for the cost of that relocation. But if the utility itself has that prior right, then the city is responsible for that financial obligation. So I hope that clarifies a few things.
Okay, and thank you. And Ms. Marino?
Yeah, that does clarify. Thanks for that answer. What I was going to say before you said that, the reason I raised my hand was I was going to say that it seems to me that, you know, as payers into that franchise, as citizens that pay into that franchise, it seems like the franchise should have a responsibility to our community to maintain whatever we need maintained. But I think what you're saying is that it's a legal situation that might be beyond our control, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, it all comes down to those prior rights. And I mean, in defense of a franchise utility, I mean, they're trying to make money just as, and save as much money just as the city's trying to do. And when we're talking big dollars, it comes down to who legally has the right to require something of the others. So that, yeah, that probably could have gone without saying, but yes.
All right.
So and it looks like.
Yep, go ahead, Ms. Anderson.
Looks like the next question is from Vice Chair White. Do you want to go ahead, Andy? I wasn't sure if you got pulled away.
Go ahead, Shannon. I think we attempted to, FEMA and state funds that may be available for specific projects. And Vice Chair White, I think we talked around it and we may have hit the target. Is there anything else you would like to hear on that?
No, I think you hit it. I mean, I guess I was kind of hoping or thinking that because of Build Back Better and some of those ideas about infrastructure that are out there, that maybe there would be something readily available in terms of matching funds for these kinds of things. Plus, essentially, the county taking responsibility as they did for the Schultz fire, the museum fire. They may have funds that are coming to them, probably from the feds, but something that they could use to help us make this project work. I'm struggling with the idea that we need to really spend 22 million in order to make this work. To me, this is a very high priority, and so you know, I hate to see other projects suffer for it, and anything we could do to share those costs will be something I think we should pursue. So you've answered the question and with kind of how long it takes.
Yeah. And Vice Chair White, Ed, you probably want to address it, but the flood control district is matching the Forest Service funds that are associated with those on-forest measures with the sediment, the alluvial fan restoration and sediment basins with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And so that's kind of above the area that we're talking about now. We're talking about as it enters the city infrastructure. Ed, I'm guessing that's what you were going to say, but.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up a couple things. So one, as Andy was mentioning, the county did get about $3 million from NRCS to do the Parkway sediment basins, which is on city property. So it's going to be a city project, but paid for out of federal funds that the county received. So that's not on this list. That's $3 million in addition to everything else that we have here, that we didn't put on the list because it is going to be fully funded, and it's moving forward. Not to beat a dead horse, but they're having the same issues with the federalization. So they're working through SHPO, which is their historic preservation office, to make sure they can actually get it done. At the city level, we still have to do quite a bit in terms of property acquisition, property rights. So even these things that seem to be a windfall and it seems to be a quick and yes, we can get moving, they still take a lot of time, and there's a lot of incidental expenses that are not included. So Parkway is one of them. Your other question is there things we can get through the infrastructure bill? One of the unfortunate things with the infrastructure bill, from what I've seen so far, I shouldn't say unfortunate for us in Flagstaff, a lot of them are competitive grants. So they have funding, but they're putting it into existing grant structures. So the ones that are most relevant for this would be the FEMA grants. So that's the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, BRIC, and the Flood Mitigation, what the A stands for, FMA, whatever that stands for. And we go out for those monies. But unfortunately, it's not fast. So it takes about 6 months for them to prioritize those projects, and then up to another year before they start doing the regulatory work to get it out to us. So it can be up to 2 years before we see funds from that, assuming that we get them. 94% of the BRIC grants in the past, and by the past I mean 2021 and before, went to coastal communities. So 94% of the money that FEMA gets for this type of work goes to hurricane response, and only 6% goes to internal states. So we're fighting an uphill battle, but we do what we can. But that's why we're putting this full list here. We're really kind of showing all our cards that this is the need. And this bond election committee, I feel for you, because there's a lot here, and I'm sure there's a lot more with the other requests from other sections.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I see Mr. Hand raised by Mr. Breyer.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. I'm just struggling with how funds are appropriated and paid off. And I recall on one of Ed's very first slides where he talked about stormwater funding, and he said that stormwater fees, so what I pay each month, are going to pay off the $54 million bond on the ACE flood control, Army Corps of Engineers flood control project. So here we're looking for half that for something that is really urgent, so I'm very supportive that this is a high priority. I'm just wondering how we decide that some things get covered by stormwater fees, other things get put to the voters and then paid off with sales tax. And this probably applies really to all of the decisions this committee is being asked, or advice we need to understand how those decisions are made. So thank you.
And I guess those decisions are made, I guess, from the collaboration of city management. I think Mr. Clifton, and working with the council, makes those decisions of the best way to address them. I don't know if Mr. Clifton has anything to add concerning to that.
Thank you. We are working in close contact with the flood control district. So all of the projects that have been discussed, and we're focusing on the ones in the city boundaries. I try to make note in the chat that there are things obviously happening above our corporate boundaries in the basin. There's a lot of partnerships happening. So those opportunities are helping to prioritize projects. Again, taking advantage of opportunities that exist now. And then as to prioritizing other projects, our feasibility study, again, will give us guidance. If the question goes to prioritizing these projects against all other projects that we're talking about, am I understanding? Is that the question, Paul?
I guess it's just more how we decide that some projects we put to the voters and say, pay it off with sales tax over the next few years. Others we say, oh, it's going to be rolled into your rate fees. Those are both reasonable things. They both fall on citizens. But, here we're advised to advise on one of these, what citizens vote on to increase our sales tax. And I'm just wondering, the bigger picture, why we were asked to do this and it wasn't put in a rate structure. And I have no agenda here. I'm just struggling to understand.
Well, a clarification and then a response. I've heard reference before to sales tax, and I will always take the opportunity to remind us, we're not talking a sales tax issue here at all. Arguably, we're not talking a new tax. We're talking probably a tax rate refinement. It is all within our property tax structure. And that refinement can occur right now because the city has done a fairly good job over the years of not maximizing its allowable property tax rate. So there is an allowance, and we're looking at tapping into that allowance. And that, Paul, and for the benefit of the group, constitutes the $90 to $100 million allowance that I believe Rick Tatter referenced when he was chatting with you. Now, all that said, it goes to the voters. And these things will be talked about at length before it goes to the voters to try to make sure people are understanding that. But to the bigger part of your question about rates, and you raised that earlier on the wastewater question, my response is a little bit similar, is the rate fees and the revenues generated from those are critically important to operating the utility. But almost always, the rate fee revenues fall short of significant capital improvements like what we're looking at today and what we saw a week ago with wastewater. The need for these capital upgrades almost always outpaces the revenues that we realize from rate fees. So one approach, and that would be the approach here, is to borrow the money through a bond issuance and then use the rate structure, hopefully, to pay the debt service on that bond over time. We cannot afford to save and pay on things like this. As I mentioned a short while ago, everything we're dealing with here, almost everything, is the result of events that have happened in the last 3 years, right? So the newness of this and the urgency of this is not something that a rate structure would adequately cover. In the case of wastewater a week ago, it's upgrading the utility that is aging and is reaching capacity. A very similar comment for different circumstances. In the ideal world, Paul, the rate fees would cover all the costs. In the real world, the tip, and every community does this. We borrow money and we use the rate fees to help pay that back, and we go after grant appropriations and other funding sources as well, because the rate fees will typically fall short of covering the entire cost. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that helped a lot. Yeah, and I apologize for calling property tax a sales tax.
Actually, it was right on cue. It's a great opportunity for me to remind it. So thank you.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and thanks. I guess the biggest thing seemed to be that we're doing that one that's twice as big from another source. But that's helpful. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Mr. Clifton. Probably on the topic of these is a question from one of our committee members, Mr. Moore, is should the requested bond funds be approved by the voters? What is the timeline for completion of these projects?
Andy or Gary, you want me to go ahead, or Andy, you want to take this?
Go ahead, Ed. Yes, please.
That's a fantastic
as soon
question.
as possible, right?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I'll say that we're going to have concept designs for everything this year through the feasibility study. Now that's a concept design, which is not a full engineered design. So it's kind of this is what we think it should look like. I don't see much in the way to slow us down for a full design for any one of these projects. Where I see some concern is property rights, property acquisitions, and utility relocates. And we're working through all of that at the feasibility study level. So for each of the projects, Peak Engineering is actually coming up with a punch list of here's the concerns that we're going to have to address besides basic drainage design. Drainage design itself is not very hard. Your gravity works, you know, it's gravity, it's velocity. How do you fit it in a pipe, or how do you fit it in a box, or whatever? But where it gets tricky is when we have to deal with humans. So that's the property rights, utility relocates, etc. And we will have those all lined out by this summer. So if this bond goes forward, if this is actually approved by the voters, I'm sure we can move pretty quickly with it. And we're showing that already with the projects we're working on right now. I gotta say, I think as Greg that mentioned, you know, light speed, we're moving quick on what we can move quick on. So if this moves forward, I think we can move pretty quickly. Now, Andy or Gary or Greg, feel free to correct me if you think I'm wrong.
No, I think that was a great answer. I just wanted to add to it and say that in the presentation last week related to wastewater projects, we talked briefly about spreading projects out over the course of the next several years because of the lack of capacity in project management. These stormwater projects are of a huge priority to the city of Flagstaff. We haven't delivered that number of stormwater projects in the city in the past, and I can't even begin to assume what our capacity is to deliver those projects. Obviously, we're going to do everything we can to deliver them as quick as possible, but I think there will be some limitations in how fast we can deliver those projects just from a staffing standpoint in our project management.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Byer, I see your hand is still raised. Do you have another question, or was just forgotten to lower the hand? Okay, I see the hand went away. If I believe all the questions were answered, I know Mr. Ghetto just put a question out there, but if there wasn't a question answered, maybe everyone in the committee, please be kind and maybe raise your hand and to make sure we get the questions answered. But the question that I have right now is from one of the committee members, Mr. Ghetto. So can we be reminded what these bond issues will cost a taxpayer in tax dollars or fees per year, either as an individual or a household, and how much debt per person? And I see Mr. Tatter is responding with one of the bullet points that presentations that we saw in the last time. And I'll let Mr. Tatter maybe respond. But again, if I remember right, this is not one bundle of question that'll be asked of the voters. And so it'll be really up to the voters what get passed and what does not get passed and what that will cost. I'll let Mr. Tatter chime in if he'd like to add anything.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I put a snippet in from the presentation we did early on in our conversation. What type of impacts residential properties would have. I think there's also a slide for commercial properties. Again, this was just scenario-based calculations, flat increases and so forth. So that's a snapshot and a concept of what it does cost. But of course, as we issue debt, what ones get approved, it does change the impact to property owners. Also understanding that, the rates that we're setting is really kind of a flat rate scenario, keeping the rates flat for property owners. And we hope that we can stay and maintain within that rate going forward. Of course, growth in assessed valuations do occur, and that will help us pay off the debt also. So a lot of moving parts to it, but hopefully that answers that question and reminds the impact that we were talking about.
Yeah, Mr. Ghetto, would you like to follow up?
Yes, I understand, and I can go back to that slide, and I think it assumed a $70 million issue, but it's just interesting to talk about. For every $10 million asked, it's going to have an impact this much on a taxpayer, regardless of who's borrowing the money. I think that would be helpful. It would also be helpful just to do a numerator denominator. How much debt does the average household take on if we grant the entire 22 million? Because these are pretty needy projects. So I'm just thinking about it in terms of real life. How much debt is this person taking on, and how much debt do they pay off as a result? And it's project more generalized, but if we could discuss it here, it would be great.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ghetto. I know when I had served on the Water Commission, we would bring our water bills with us and take a look at them and see what that line item would look like. And as you mentioned, real world life, that is what everyone would look at, is their bills. And maybe at some point that could be a discussion we can have as we get a little closer to making decisions. You know, what will that bill look like? And so great point. And I want to get to Miss Marino. She had a question.
Yeah, I think one of my questions in the chat box might have gotten missed. And I'll just say up front too, the reason I'm asking so many questions about these projects is not because I doubt them at all, but because I see the deep importance of them. Especially, I personally live in Greenlaw and have been personally, seen all the flooding issues and been affected by them myself. So my question had to do with the South Mount Eldon detention design. And I believe you said that it would go along that gas pipeline. And I'm curious what kind of impacts we would see on the forest and the trails in that area, as it's a very high use area for all the people who live in these neighborhoods.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I can take that for Andy and Greg. So the detention facility would actually not be on the Forest Service. It would be on an unused 6-acre parcel that Kinder Morgan has, the pipeline has. So in between the pipeline footprint that, as we know it, that kind of dirt road, and then the Forest Service property proper. So in that section, there actually isn't a trail because it is private property. I've walked the entirety of that 6-acre parcel. So there'd be no impact where the detention basin would be situated. For the diversion structure, it would run along part of the pipeline road. I don't foresee it impacting the pipeline road. And the reason I say that is because Kinder Morgan, rightfully so, really wants no impact above their main line there, because that's a huge amount of natural gas that they have moving from the West Coast to the East Coast, or East Coast to West Coast. I'm not sure which direction it goes. So essentially that road would still be open, the one that people use for walking their dogs or mountain biking or whatnot. I don't foresee us getting any access from Kinder Morgan to have the diversion structure in the middle of their pipeline. It would have to be staged off to one side or the other. And again, the reason that they're willing to work with us is because they don't want to see flooding either. The thought of having, trees and boulders and whatnot going across a high pressure natural gas line probably keeps them up more at night than it keeps us up, because they probably know the risk better than we do there. So to make, I'm answering your question very long, or I'm not making this short, I should say. I don't foresee a huge impact to the trail network from either one of the projects.
Okay, thank you. Miss Marino, does that answer questions for now? Oh, I'm not hearing anything. Yes. Okay. Yes, it does. So thank you. We do have a question from Vice Chair White. Where does the stormwater we pull out of our streets, I guess, end up? If I caught it, the chat box moves and then I lose my question. And so I think I got the gist of Ian.
So yeah, basically, before there was a fire, all of that water stayed up in the mountain. Since there's a fire, now it comes flying down the hill. And now we're going to make it easier for it to pass through our city as opposed to inundating our city. Where does it all end up?
Al, you sound like a hydrologist. No, that's a great question. I'm laughing because that's something we don't. That by we, I mean governments in general, not just City of Flagstaff, don't always fully address. Is yeah, everything moves downstream. So it doesn't matter what project you do, it's going to have an impact somewhere downstream. The short answer to it is it will end up in the Rio de Flag, and then from the Rio de Flag. What's that?
It'll go into the aquifer at some point.
Yeah, it will. At some point, it'll all infiltrate. It never makes it to the Little Colorado River. Even in our biggest floods, it never makes it all the way down there. So what it does right now, and this is a mess. So we get tons, over 10,000 tons this last year, just in the streets and whatnot. It gets a little less attention. Is there's still a lot of sediment that stayed in the channel and went downstream. And where that falls out is wherever the slope or wherever that grade flattens out. So where that happens to be is 4th and Butler down to the Humane Society area, just upstream of Fox Glen Park. And if you went out there at all during summer, it was a mud pit. We actually had the Arizona National Guard out there helping us clean it out. They spent 2 weeks getting all their equipment stuck in the mud. So that's where it ends up right now. And then we actually have a crew working this week in Fox Glen trying to clean out the channel there because we actually filled most of the channel with mud from Spruce Wash all the way down at Fox Glen. So they're actually cleaning that out with a bobcat right now, our water services operators. With these improvements, we'll have less sediment, because we're actually going to have those detention basins upstream, and then we're going to have more armored sections and detention basins at Killip School. So we're going to have cleaner water that makes it down to the Rio. And by the time it makes it to the Rio, it should attenuate out. By attenuate out, I mean it's not going to be a big slug of water. It's going to be kind of spread out through time as it slows down in different eddies and whatnot before it gets down to Fox Glen. So once it makes it to Fox Glen, we should be able to meter it out through Country Club area and then through Picture Canyon. And as it's going through there, it'll continue to infiltrate into the aquifer until it completely dissipates out somewhere in Doney Park. But it's a great question. It is something we're going to have to make sure that we have engineered out correctly, that make sure that we're not pushing a flood into somebody else's neighborhood. But from what we've seen, it shouldn't do that unless it's an extreme event. But it will be something that we look at within the feasibility study.
And then Al, and thank you, Ed, whatever, because of the fire and the sedimentation and the debris that results in the neighborhoods from the fire, ultimately then winds up in the landfill. I don't remember the total tonnage. We'll have to ask Scott Overton that number. He could probably tell you just right now if you would ask him, but it's
11,000 tons. I remember that from his presentation.
Yeah, Ed knows it as well. So
Don't get me started on the landfill, please.
All right, thank you. Just to kind of go along with the chat box here, Mr. Thompson, is there anything you would like to ask or add to the discussion?
If Stephen wants to add, I kind of tried to address the comment that was made. I did provide another little snapshot from a presentation that we did back last month. And, the baseline, talking about every 10 million in a bond is about $22 for the residential property. That also is in line with what we showed you as a sample bill for current taxpayers under the 0.8 rate. As you can see, let me bring up that slide instead. It may be easier for me to point that out. Just a second here.
Also, Rick, for many of us anyway, you can click on that slide in the chat and it will enlarge.
Yeah, so let me see if I can actually bring up that slide too. Sorry about this little delay here. I'm just going to share my screen and get to that. I think I can get there faster. Okay, here it is up on screen. I believe you guys can see it now. If we take the concept, you know, of course, there's some errors in what we think as far as that, just the high level view of the impact. Here you see in a slide from last month, we were talking about the 0.8 rate for current taxpayers. You can see it is about $216 on their tax bill on an annual basis. So if you take that concept of 100 million was kind of our capacity, and you divide that into, you know, $10 million chunks, it is right about that $22 for that layer of a $10 million debt. So that's where I'm kind of getting to that impact on an annual basis to pay off that debt service. And it conforms to the consideration that $10 million would have a $22 annual impact, because we're talking about layers of that property tax bill. And that's where my comments are kind of aligned in the theory. So hopefully that helps.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tanner. I think we got through all the questions. If someone would like to ask something or add a comment, if you could raise your hand before we close out today's meeting. I see Mr. Ghetto has his hand raised. Go ahead.
Yes, I want to go back to that last slide. It was an excellent presentation, very briefly, of, you know, I look at it as really a sales job, because if we ask the full 70 million, we're asking, you know, household 50 cents a day to get to the $154 a year. And I think when you frame some of the major hardships our utilities are up against here in our community, and the 50 cents a day kind of thing, it's a lot easier to sell to somebody, because we do need these things. And I don't think when it's presented that way that it's insurmountable. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ghetto. Mr. Thompson has his hand raised.
Yes, good afternoon. So my comment was based on several factors. Number one, you know, I think we picked it in one slide, we picked $270,000 out of the thin air, and in the other it was $287,000. And I think we all recognize that hypothetical doesn't exist in our community at this point, that most property owners are far greater than that. Number one. Number two, I agree with Ron that we have a sales job to do, to the extent that any of the bonds that we want to submit to the voters, you know, to the extent we go forward with any of these, we're going to have a sales job. And I don't think that we should hide the ball in terms of what the cost will be. Number one, there's no such thing as a $270,000 house. Number two, and more importantly, every commercial property in town is going to be paying additional property taxes, and every commercial property owner in town is going to pass those costs on to their tenants or to the consumer. And so we're going to have, in addition to a minimum wage, it's going to go well above $16, you know, in 10 months. We're also going to have the potential for sales tax increases. And then our property taxes on top of that is a compounding of a compounding of a compounding. And again, it's just, I don't want to say real simplistically, hey, $22 per household when we go out, you know, to the extent that any of these go forward out to the public, and have people go, wait a second, what about, you know, increased costs? What about more expensive properties? Because those things clearly are going to be part of what people are paying, you know, for everyday services, for everyday goods, to the extent that again, commercial landowners are going to be passing those additional property taxes on.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Clifton has his hand raised.
Yeah, I'm actually glad to be hearing these comments because I think they touch on a very important point here that I wholly agree with. I don't think we should be glossing this over in any way, shape, or form. And I think as time marches on, we'll have a lot more clarity on the talking points. I also agree with Ron's comment that sometimes this needs to be articulated in a manner that people can get their head around because, you know, a few $100s a year may have a shock factor. 50 cents a day might be a doable. I don't know. These are things also that the consultants can help us out with. But to the comment just made, and thank you, I agree. I don't think we should be glossing these things over. I have not heard from, I actually have heard from this council a very strong opposition to any sales tax. So I just want to keep getting that out there. There's nothing I'm hearing to suggest that we have that kind of question out there on the horizon, and rather a pretty strongly voiced aversion to that concept. So everything thus far is either in the property tax realm or another instrument. The city paid off its pension fund through some lease purchase agreements, a certificate of participation in the financial world. That's what they call it. Very creative approach to doing something. I don't know that these other tools are available here. We've been talking a lot about grant dollars. We will pursue any and all grant dollars that we can. But I think the comments just made are very well stated, and thanks for sharing.
All right, thank you, Mr. Clifton. I just saw a hand raised, so let me get to it I think Mr. Thompson, your hand's still raised. I'm assuming you just forgot to lower it, or would you like to add? I'm not seeing anything real quick. I did have a question on chat that I'd like to be answered. We all found out through the paper and everything that the county has received some federal dollars concerning this topic. Mr. Clifton, maybe you'd like to share what has the county has shared of any of those dollars to help with the flood mitigation with the city, or these dollars pretty much on county lands, etc.
That might have been referenced to both Forest Service appropriations, and I refer to it as NRCS in the chat. That's the Natural Resource Conservation Service. I hope I got that acronym right. Both those appropriations coming from federal agencies, and those are happening. Andy Bertelson or Rick Tatter or anybody else, are there other federal appropriations the county is realizing that I'm not speaking to?
Yeah, no, you got it right, Greg. Natural Resources Conservation Service. And so the funds appropriated to the county that we are aware of, the Forest Service funding and the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the county is then utilizing the flood control district to match those funds. And so essentially the direction that's been taken, or how this is sort of unfolded and been bifurcated, is the county's been working kind of above the city limits and on the national forest, and have been contributing and utilizing flood control district funds for those matches and for those projects. And then we, the city, are taking responsibility for the projects in the city. That said, over the last 2 years, the flood control district, and I can't cite the numbers to you, the sandbags, the cleanup efforts, etc. We've been hand in hand in those efforts. And so while the flood control district may not have written a check to the city, so to speak, it's been a cooperative effort to date and continues to be.
All right, thank you, Andy. And Mr. Dominguez had his hand up. Go ahead.
Sorry, Charlie. I think I just made a mistake.
Oh, okay. So with that, I always like to close out the meetings with handing to the vice chair, Mr. White, if he'd like to make any comments.
Thanks, Charlie. I don't have anything further at this point in time. I'm hoping that, and Shannon can probably answer this as we move on down the line, and we don't necessarily have to answer it now. The schedule we're on is fairly tight. We're talking about presentations all the way through March 3rd. At that point in time, the publicity gang wants to do a survey. And are we waiting till we get that survey back to start deliberating on what we're talking about in terms of trying to prioritize and work through this massive task?
Thanks for that question, Vice Chair White. We actually had discussions between city staff and New Point Marketing this week already. They're going to be working on developing some methodology that will help the committee talk through all the information that you've received and start prioritizing that list. And they will fold in having that research or that input from the community as a result to that survey. So we are working on that, and we will bring that to you so that way you will have it prior to those deliberations.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.
Share.
All right. Thank you, Mr. White, and thank you, Ms. Anderson. And then with that, I really want to thank everybody who, in our participation. We just have very few that are not here with us today among the committee members. So nearly 100% participation rate, which is great to see so many taking the time out of your livelihood, your time. That's so precious to be participating in this very important endeavor with a final result of making a recommendation to the council. Really appreciate it. I'm just going to close out with a comment that I'm hoping maybe one of the council members might be listening to us now or maybe in the future to maybe take a look at stormwater rates. We did that in 2018. It was an exercise that we, at the end of the day, found out stormwater rates was very equitable of getting things accomplished and getting things done for the community in a very orderly and a quick manner, because stormwater rates could be in place and doing projects before the voters even asked of this question. So I'll just leave it at that for consideration among council members to make those decisions. And thank you, everybody, and everyone have a good night.
You bet.
Thank you all. Have a good night. Stay warm.